All right, so the red carpet is being rolled out for visiting Russian President Vladimir Putin. It's the first time he's visiting India since the Russia-Ukraine war began more than 3 years ago. What to expect and how may this be watched and viewed and assessed in Washington, particularly by Donald Trump, the US president? Joining me now is a very special guest, one of the foremost Russia scholars in the world. Professor John Mearsheimer is with the Political Science Department at the University of Chicago. Thank you very much, Professor, for speaking with us. So a lot of pomp and ceremony,
My pleasure.
a lot of agreements are expected to be signed between India and Russia. This is the first time that President Putin is visiting India since the war in Ukraine began. What sort of message do you reckon India, the government, Mr. Modi is sending out through this visit, and particularly what sort of message, how will it be viewed in the White House?
Well, the fact is that the White House would like to drive a wedge between Russia and India. The main reason, I believe, not the only reason, but the main reason that the White House is angry with India these days is in large part because India has close relations with Russia and is importing a lot of Russian oil. And as everybody knows, the United States wants to force Russia. They want to coerce or compel Russia to end the war in Ukraine. And we believe here in the United States, I don't believe this, but most people in the United States believe that if we can get India and China to cut off the flow of oil from Russia to those two countries, that will force Russia to reach a deal on Ukraine, which is what the White House wants. And they therefore view India as an obstacle toward achieving that end.
But what then explains why only India is facing these oil tariffs? China imports more Russian oil than India does, but there's no oil tariffs on China.
Well, it's because China has much more economic leverage over the United States than India does. Trump tried to play hardball with China. He tried to get tougher with China than he has been with India. But he failed because the Chinese have a number of cards they can play involving things like rare earths and rare earth magnets that the United States desperately needs. So Trump was forced to back off vis-a-vis China, but he's not been forced to back off vis-a-vis India. So he continues to see India as the one country that he can pressure to help force the Russians to reach some sort of agreement on the Ukraine deal. But this is obviously not going to happen.
But the view here in India, Professor, seems to be that Trump is only forcibly pushing India more into the Russia corner by imposing these sanctions on Russian oil. And there's nothing to suggest in the last 3 months since these sanctions have come in place, since these tariffs have come in place, there's nothing to suggest that Indian import of Russian oil has actually come down. If anything, it's actually remained at the same level or gone up marginally.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is a remarkably foolish policy. I think that the Trump administration, which came into office looking like it was going to have excellent relations with India, has fundamentally moved in the wrong direction by causing all sorts of trouble with India, mainly by putting 50% tariffs on India, is a fundamental mistake. And the idea that you can get tougher and tougher with India and India is going to cave, I believe, is misguided thinking.
And at what point does Trump relent? And if he doesn't relent, then can India sort of offset some of the damage that it's seeing in the India-US trade relationship? Can it sell some of those products to Russia or to Europe or anywhere else in the West?
Well, the problem here is the Ukraine war, right? In fact, Trump wants to have good relations with both Russia and India. I know this sounds odd, but Trump is interested in settling the Ukraine war and improving U.S.-Russian relations. And he has no interest in having bad relations with India. It makes no sense unless you think that is a way of solving the Ukraine crisis. So the taproot of this whole problem involving the United States, Russia, and India is the Ukraine war. Trump thought that he could settle it before he moved into the White House, and certainly settle it once he moved into the White House. But he has failed, and he's desperate now. And the end result is that he has not been able to improve relations with Russia. And in fact, U.S. relations with India have gone south. And because there is no evidence that the Ukraine war is going to be settled anytime soon, there's going to be no improvement, in my opinion, in either U.S. Indian relations or U.S. Russian relations. And I think the best thing India can do at this point in time is make sure that it maintains good relations with the Russians, but doesn't do anything to antagonize the Americans any more than they've already been antagonized.
Where is that war as you see it? I mean, this week, Steve Witkoff, who is Trump's envoy, Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, were at the Kremlin. They spent 5 hours speaking to Putin. Do you think the needle is moved? Are we anywhere closer to finding a ceasefire or some kind of temporary truce? What is your assessment?
Absolutely not. And Ushakov, Yuri Ushakov, who is the principal Russian spokesman on this issue and who was present at the meeting, made it very clear afterwards that there has been no progress at all. And I believe there cannot be any progress, that there's no way that this war can be settled diplomatically. And that's because the Russians on one side and the Ukrainians and the West on the other side have irreconcilable goals. There's no way that the Ukrainians and the Europeans are going to cave in to Russia's principal demands. And the Russians have made it clear that those principal demands are non-negotiable. So there's no way you're going to get a deal here. And therefore, this meeting in Moscow for 5 hours was just a waste of time. This is going nowhere. So the problem that India faces is that the problem is not going to go away. And at some point, the Russians are going to win on the battlefield. And this is going to cause huge trouble for Trump. Trump is in trouble on a number of fronts, both domestically and internationally. And if the Ukrainians fall apart in their fight against the Russians, this will be a huge black mark for the Trump administration. And this is the context in which India operates. And India is in a very delicate position, in my opinion. And what India should do, I think, is just downplay its antagonism with the United States as much as possible, say all the right things, but fully understand that there's not anything they can do to meaningfully improve relations with the United States until the Ukraine war is settled one way or another.
So the broad contours of this 28-point peace plan, which Trump has put up and his envoys are negotiating with the Kremlin, the nub of it seems to be that the remaining areas of the Donbass region, I think there's about 10% or so in Donetsk, which is still under Ukrainian control. If Ukraine were to give that up and Russia keeps those 4 provinces in the east, then it might be open to some kind of a ceasefire. Is that a reasonable sort of inference of where things stand right now? And what is it that will take Vladimir Putin to end this war?
With all due respect, I don't think that would do the trick. First of all, the Russians have no interest in a ceasefire because they're doing well militarily on the battlefield, and they see a ceasefire as a way for Ukraine to stop the war temporarily and rearm. So the Russians say there has to be a genuine peace agreement. Now, you raised the issue of territory, and there's no question that the Russians demand that Ukraine and the West recognize their annexation of these 4 oblasts in the east, plus Crimea. But there are 2 other huge issues floating around out there. One is the question of admission to NATO and security guarantees. It looks like admission to NATO might be taken off the table. But the fact is, the West still is talking about meaningful security guarantees for Ukraine, which is a de facto version of NATO membership. The Russians say this is unacceptable. And then finally, there's the whole question of disarmament. The Russians demanded back in the Istanbul negotiations in March, April of 2022, when they were negotiating, the Russians were negotiating with the Ukrainians, that the standing Ukrainian army, once the war was ended, be about 85,000 men. That was the Russian demand. The Ukrainians said at the time that the number should be 250,000. Well, the West is now talking about a standing Ukrainian army of 800,000 men, maybe 600,000 men. These numbers are categorically unacceptable to the Russians. So you have huge problems on the disarmament front, you have huge problems on the security guarantee front, and you were raising the issue of territory. The Ukrainians have made it clear, and the Europeans have made it clear, that they won't agree to giving up any Ukrainian territory to Russia. So this is why this is a non-starter, and it's going to be settled on the battlefield, and it's going to be settled in Russia's favor.
One of the things that President Putin also spoke about just before coming to New Delhi, and I think his press secretary elaborated that in greater detail, is that they want to have more economic engagement with India. They want to have with India the kind of no-limits partnership that they have with China. You think it's possible at all?
I think there's no question that the Russians are desperate to have good relations with countries outside of the West. And India is a prime candidate from Moscow's perspective to have good relations, both economic and political. So I would imagine that the Russians will be willing to cut a good number of sweetheart deals with the Indians, because the Russians, again, have a vested interest in having good relations with countries outside of the West.
The view here in Delhi seems to be, particularly since the start of this war, is that Russia has moved closer and closer into Beijing's embrace. And that for India has problems because of our own problems with China.
Yes, that's exactly right. And by the way, I would point out to you that that too is driven by the Ukraine war. It shows you just how important the Ukraine war is for India, as paradoxical as that might seem. But what's happened here is that because of what's happening in Ukraine, the fact that the United States is basically at war with Russia in Ukraine, that has driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. It has caused them to have remarkably close relations, close relations that they wouldn't have absent the Ukraine war. This is a problem for India because India faces a serious threat from China. I would argue that the major threat facing India today and in the foreseeable future comes not from the United States or from Russia, it comes from China. But the problem is that the Russians cannot in any way at this point in time help India deal with China, because Russia is in a full body embrace with China, again, because of the Ukraine war.
And a final word, so I'll come back to something that you said earlier. So your advice, if you were asked advice by the Indian government, would be to deepen its engagement with Russia, but at the same time, do not antagonize the United States, and particularly Donald Trump.
Yes, I think that there's no question India is in a difficult situation here. It's not a catastrophic situation by any means. They're in a very difficult situation. India has to walk a fine line. India has a deep-seated interest in having very good relations with Russia. It has a deep-seated interest in increasing trade with Russia, importing important weapon systems like the S-500, and maybe this fifth generation fighter plane that they're talking about. But there's no question India wants to have good relations with Russia moving forward. But at the same time, it certainly doesn't want to antagonize the Americans. It wants to do everything it can to ameliorate the problem that it faces. Of course, that's hard to do because of the Ukraine war. But I think that India can go a long way towards not exacerbating the situation with the United States, which is the best I think you can hope for at this point in time.
All right, Professor John Mearsheimer, it's always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for joining us, sir. Thank you for your time and your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on the show.